Hello, you are on the channel The Truths of Life. And let me ask you a question that you may never have had the courage to say out loud. What if God's silence is not absence, but the beginning of something that will change everything? We have all gone through moments when we pray, insist, cry out, and yet heaven seems closed. The words come out of the mouth, but do not come back with an answer. Faith is still there, but comfort does not come. And it is at this point that many begin to wonder if God still listens, if he has walked away, or if something has gone wrong along the way. The Bible calls these moments silence, but the human heart often calls them abandonment. What few people realize is that God's silence is not an error of faith, it is part of the process. Throughout Scripture, we see men and women who walked with God face periods when no answer came, no sign appeared, and no explanation was given. Still, something was going on behind the scenes of the story, something invisible, profound, transformative. Maybe you're living exactly that kind of phase right now. You believe, you trust, but you don't feel. You read God's word, but it doesn't seem to answer your most pressing questions. And the more time passes, the more the silence weighs. The Bible does not ignore this kind of pain. On the contrary, it clearly records moments when even God's great chosen ones felt that heaven was closed. Spiritual silence does not mean divine distance. Often, it means preparation. It means that God is working in areas that the eye cannot see. While we wait for an answer, he shapes character. As we ask for direction, he strengthens faith. As we cry out for relief, he prepares something greater than what we ask for. Biblical history is full of examples of days when God was silent and everything changed afterward. Before big calls, there were long periods without a voice. Before historic liberations, there was waiting. Before promises were fulfilled, there were nights of doubt and days without explanation. And it is precisely in these moments that many give up without realizing that they were closer than they imagined. In this video, you'll understand why God's silence appears so often in the Bible, what it really means, and how it can be directly linked to the purpose he is building in your life. Let's look at deep biblical stories, go through periods when God seemed absent, and find out what was happening when no one was listening to anything. If you've ever wondered why God didn't answer when you needed it most, if you've ever felt that praying hurt more than being silent, then this content is for you, because before God speaks, something needs to happen inside us. And before the sky opens, there's a reason it feels closed. And before we go deeper into this story, I want to invite you to do something simple, but very powerful. If this question has touched you in any way, leave your like now. This helps the video reach other people who are also living this silence and need to hear this message. If you've been through or are experiencing a time when it seems like God doesn't respond, comment below something like, "I've felt it." Sometimes, writing is the first step to not feeling alone on this journey. And if you are not yet subscribed, subscribe to the channel The Truth of Life. Here we talk about faith, the Bible, and purpose in depth, without masks and without shallow answers. Your engagement isn't just a number. It keeps that message reaching lives that are right where you've been or where you are right now. There are days when praying doesn't bring relief. The words come out of the mouth, but seem to fall to the ground before they even reach the sky. You bend your knees, close your eyes, try to repeat the same prayers that once worked, and nothing changes. The heart is still heavy. The pain does not subside. The silence remains. And that's exactly where one of the most disconcerting moments of faith begins. When seeking God doesn't generate immediate consolation, when crying does not bring peace, when prayer, instead of calming, seems to open up the emptiness inside even more. This type of day does not usually appear in ready-made testimonies or motivational phrases, but it exists. And more people experience this than they admit, because there is a kind of silence that does not come from the absence of words, but from the absence of response. A silence that hurts because you are doing everything right. You're praying, trusting, hoping, and yet it seems that God was silent. The Bible calls it a variety of ways: silence of God, closed sky, lead time, trial. In practice, the feeling is only one apparent abandon. That's when you start to wonder if your prayers are being heard or if they're echoing in a spiritual void. And the hardest thing is not the pain itself, but the confusion, because you believe, you have faith, you know the word, and yet nothing happens. This clash between faith and reality is one of the greatest spiritual tests anyone can face, because it messes with the basis of our relationship with God. He touches on that question that almost no one likes to ask out loud. What if God is listening to me, but you chose not to answer now? This kind of thinking is scary. It is guilty. It makes a person feel weak spiritually. Many begin to compare themselves with others who seem to receive quick answers, visible miracles, open doors. And then a silent pain is born inside the heart. The feeling that you have been left behind, that something is wrong with you. But the truth is, this moment when praying doesn't bring relief is not a sign of weak faith. On the contrary, usually it appears just when faith is being taken to a deeper level. It's easy to trust when the answer comes fast. It is difficult to remain when silence is extended. And this is where many people give up, not because he stopped believing in God, but because he got tired of waiting without signs. The prolonged silence is tiring. It wears out you. It tests perseverance. It confronts our expectations of who God is and how he should act. And, without realizing it, the prayer begins to change tone. Before, she was full of hope. Now, it comes loaded with frustration. Before I was confident. Now, it is accompanied by unanswered questions. And yet, something keeps you praying, even without feeling anything, even without receiving anything. There is a mystery in this, an invisible call to remain. Because somehow, deep down, you feel that this silence is not empty, that there is something being prepared, even if you can't see it. The Bible is full of moments like this. People who prayed, waited, cried out, and faced long periods without response. Days when God seemed far away, skies that seemed closed. And, curiously, these periods almost always preceded profound changes. Not superficial changes, but twists that transformed entire stories. But while we are inside the silence, this is not clear. Silence confuses before clarifying. It hurts before teaching. He seems to deny before revealing. And that's exactly why this topic touches so deeply. Because, at some level, we've all been there. Praying without relief, waiting with no sign, believing without feeling. When the sky seems closed, the feeling is not just of silence, it is of distance. It's not that God has disappeared, but it's as if there's something between you and him, an invisible barrier that prevents any response from getting through. You pray and you feel that the words go up, but they do not go beyond the ceiling. You read the Bible and the texts that once warmed the heart now seem neutral, almost cold. The songs that once brought peace no longer produce the same effect. And, without realizing it, a dangerous, albeit silent thought is born. Has God moved away from me? This thought is rarely said out loud because it generates guilt. The person feels ashamed for even considering it. After all, from an early age we were taught that God never abandons. And this is true, but the emotional experience of closed heaven does not cease to exist just because biblical truth exists. The heart feels before it understands. And when the sky seems closed, emotion screams louder than theology. It's like walking on a familiar road and suddenly losing all the signs. You are still on the path, but you no longer know where you are. This state generates spiritual insecurity. The person begins to question their decisions, their past choices, their failures. Did I do something wrong? Have I sinned and not perceived? Is God correcting me? The closed sky is often accompanied by heavy self-demand. You revisit old mistakes, remember words you said, actions you took, promises you didn't keep, and God's silence is interpreted as reproach, as if he were watching from afar, in silence, waiting for you to learn your lesson. This is one of the loneliest moments of faith, because even surrounded by people, no one can feel exactly what you feel. Others say trust, wait, God knows everything. True phrases, but they do not reach the pain of those who are living the closed sky in practice. Because the problem is not intellectual. It's emotional. It is spiritual. It's that feeling of talking to someone you love deeply and not hearing any response back. Prolonged silence creates internal noises. The mind begins to fill the empty spaces with assumptions, and these assumptions are almost never positive. The absence of response becomes synonymous with rejection. Delay becomes synonymous with denial. And little by little, the person begins to move away not out of lack of faith, but out of emotional protection. Praying hurts. Waiting is tiring. Believing without feeling hurts. So, in order not to get frustrated anymore, the heart closes a little too. It is an almost unconscious movement. You continue to believe in God, but you diminish the expectation. He continues to pray, but without so much hope. He continues to search, but with less intensity, not because you stopped loving God, but because the closed sky taught you not to expect too much. This is one of the most subtle and dangerous effects of spiritual silence. He does not destroy faith all at once. It wears it down slowly, and that is exactly why this theme generates so much identification. Because those who have never felt the closed ski, achisomi point, will still feel it. Whether in a loss, in a long way in a prayer that does not seem to move out of place. The Bible does not ignore this experience. On the contrary, it registers such cries with brutal honesty. Men and women who said, without filters, that God seemed distant, that the sky seemed closed, that the answers did not come. And the most intriguing thing is that these records are not censored. They are there, preserved, as if God himself wanted us to know. This feeling does not exclude you from faith. He is part of the journey. But while we are inside it, this is not clear. The closed sky does not come with an instruction manual. It only comes with silence. And this silence creates a purposeful discomfort, an emptiness that bothers us, an absence that provokes, a weight that seems unfair. It's as if something is being stretched inside of us. Patience, trust, dependence. But at this point in the story, none of this is explained yet. All that exists is the raw sense of spiritual abandonment, even if we continue to believe. And it is precisely then that many biblical stories begin to take shape, even when no one notices. The silence that no one expects from God is usually the most disconcerting of all, because it breaks a deep expectation that we carry almost without realizing it. From an early age, we learn that God speaks, guides, responds, corrects, consoles. The Bible is full of phrases like, "And the Lord said," "And God spoke," and "The word of the Lord came." So when we enter a phase of life where all we receive is silence, something inside us short circuits. It is not only the absence of an answer that bothers us. It is the contradiction between what we believe about God and what we are living with Him. The heart thinks, God is present. Present now? If He's so only our wising distant. This silence does not resemble human indifference, because we know that God is not indifferent. Precisely because of this, it hurts more. It is a silence that makes no sense at first glance. A silence that is not accompanied by explanations, clear signs, or prior warnings. It just happens. And when it happens, it dismantles our most basic certainties about how faith should work. Many enter the spiritual life believing, even if unconsciously, that there will be quick answers, clear directions, frequent confirmations, not necessarily miracles all the time, but at least some kind of return, a feeling, an immediate peace, a specific word. But there are times when God seems to break this pattern. He doesn't speak like He used to. It does not act as before. It does not manifest itself in the way we expect. And this generates a silent frustration, because no one likes to admit that they are disappointed in God. Then disappointment turns into confusion. Confusion turns into anxiety. And anxiety becomes a desperate search for signs. The person begins to interpret everything as a possible answer, a loose verse, a random phrase, a confused dream. Anything will do, as long as it fills the void left by divine silence. But the silence continues, and that's exactly what no one expects from God, that He be silent when we need a word the most, when we are lost, tired, with important decisions ahead, with pains that we do not know how to manage. Humanly, this would be the ideal time for God to speak loud and clear. But in many biblical stories, it is precisely there that he falls silent. And this detail completely changes the way we understand faith, because it forces us to realize that God doesn't move just to relieve our immediate anxiety. He does not always respond at the pace of our urgency. God's silence reveals something we prefer not to face. We often seek answers when God is most interested in transforming the questioner. Silence does not mean absence of action. It means no noise. While all is quiet outside, something begins to be confronted inside. Expectations are exposed. Motivations come to the fore. Faith begins to be tested not by what it receives, but by what it sustains. This is where many people give up, because serving a God who speaks is comfortable. But trusting in a God who is silent requires spiritual maturity. It requires staying even without feeling, obeying even without understanding, continuing even without visible signs. And this goes against everything our nature desires. We want control. We want predictability. We want guarantees. God's silence takes all of this away from us at the same time, and he asks a silent question in return. Do you trust me only when I speak, or also when I am silent? This question does not come in the form of a voice, but in the form of an experience, and it crosses entire generations in the Bible. Before God's great moves, there are periods when the sky seems too quiet, too long, too unfair. But at this moment in history, those who live in silence still do not know what he is preparing. He only feels the weight of the absence of answers. And it is exactly in this scenario that one of the most striking figures in the scriptures appears. Someone who felt the call, carried the promise, but lived with a silence that no one would expect from God. When we talk about God's silence, many people think that it is something modern, almost like a crisis of faith in our days. But the truth is that the first great silence of the Bible appears early in human history, and it is much deeper than we usually realize. After sin enters the world, after the direct relationship between God and man is broken in Eden, something changes dramatically. The sky, which was once open, now seems distant. God is still present, still acts, still observes, but does not speak as often or in the same way. There are entire periods in Scripture when there is not a single direct word from God recorded, and this does not happen by chance. This initial silence establishes a spiritual pattern that runs through the entire Bible. He shows that silence is not a flaw in the divine plan, but part of it. In Genesis, after great events, there are long intervals without records of God speaking. The biblical text continues. History advances, people are born, live, die, and the sky seems quiet. For those who read carefully, this raises an uncomfortable question. Was God absent or just silent? Because there is a huge difference between the two things. Absence is abandonment. Silence is choice. And the Bible makes it clear, early on, that God chooses when to speak and when to be silent. One of the strongest examples of this appears between the end of the book of Malachi and the beginning of the Gospels. It has been about 400 years without any new prophetic word recorded. For centuries of closed heaven, of apparent divine silence, of entire generations living without hearing a "Thus saith the Lord." And yet, God had not lost control of history. On the contrary, while the sky seemed silent, the stage was being set for something that would change everything. This pattern repeats itself several times. Before liberations, there is silence. Before being called, there is silence. Before big revelations, there is silence. The problem is that those who live within silence do not see what is being built behind the scenes. He just feels the waiting. He only feels the absence of answers. He only feels the weight of continuing to believe without receiving anything in return. And that's exactly why silence becomes such a profound test. He separates those who trust in God's voice from those who trust in God's character, because trusting the voice is easy when it speaks. To trust in character is to remain when it is silent. The first great silence of the Bible is not accompanied by explanations, and this is intentional. God is not justified. He does not ask for patience. He simply continues to drive the story without revealing his every move. This teaches us something essential. Biblical faith was never built solely on immediate responses, but on progressive trust. Each generation needed to learn to walk without relying on constant signals. I needed to learn to obey even when I didn't understand everything. He needed to learn to wait without visible guarantees. And this divine logic clashes directly with ours, because we want clarity before moving forward. God often calls for advancement before clarity. We want to listen and then trust. God often asks for trust before he speaks. This initial silence of Scripture creates a tension that runs through the entire biblical narrative and sets the stage for individual stories of people who have experienced it firsthand. People who knew God existed, who believed in the promises, who carried a sense of purpose, but who lived long periods without any direct response from heaven. And among all these stories, there is one that stands out in a special way, because in it God's silence did not come after the error, but before the action. A story that begins with expectation, calling, and potential, but soon plunges into a silence that no one was prepared to face. If this collective silence of the Bible is already disconcerting, imagine what happens when it manifests itself in a personal way, directly reaching someone who knew they had been set apart for something great. When we reach this point in biblical history, silence ceases to be just a concept and becomes a profound collective experience. The last verses of the Old Testament close with warning, expectation, and promise. But after that, nothing. No new prophecy recorded, no direct words, no audible voice from heaven. 400 years pass, as if God had withdrawn from the scene. Generations have been born, raised, and died without ever hearing a prophet say, "Thus saith the Lord." For those who lived at that time, the feeling was brutal. The God who had opened the sea, torn down walls, and spoken to kings now seemed completely absent. The sky was closed. The silence did not last days or years, but centuries. And this generates an uncomfortable but inevitable question. How can we continue to believe when silence crosses entire generations? Because it's one thing to wait a few months. It's another to live a whole life without hearing anything. This period between Malachi and the Gospels is not an irrelevant void of the Bible. On the contrary, it is one of the most spiritually charged intervals in the entire narrative. The people continued with the sacred texts, continued with the promises, continued with the memory of past deeds, but there was no new direction. There was no confirmation. There was no current response. It was like living sustained only by the memory of what God had already done, with no evidence of what he was doing now. And that tests faith in a much deeper way than pain or suffering, because pain still generates outcry. Prolonged silence generates weariness. It slowly erodes expectation. He makes faith leave the field of emotion and enter the field of decision. Many began to wonder if it was still worth obeying. Others began to perform rituals without any more hope. Some have reinterpreted the promises. Others simply gave up on expecting something new. And it is in this environment that God was working invisibly. While the sky seemed silent, empires were being raised and toppled. Roads were being built. Languages were being unified. The world was being prepared to receive a message that would need to spread quickly. But those who lived within that silence had no way of seeing it. To them, it seemed just abandonment. And this is exactly where silence becomes dangerous for those who do not understand God's character. Because when there is no voice, the mind begins to create interpretations. When there is no answer, the heart tries to fill the voids. Many began to think that God had changed. Others concluded that he had departed. Some even thought that the promises had been cancelled. But silence did not mean cancellation. It meant alignment. God was not late. He was synchronizing everything. The problem is that God's timing rarely coincides with our sense of urgency. To those who wait, 400 years seem like eternity. For those who see the whole story, it's just a strategic break. This period shows something essential about biblical faith. It was not built to survive only in moments of manifestation, but mainly in periods of noticeable absence. Silence was not a mistake in the plan. It was part of him, and this completely changes the way we see the moments when God seems to disappear. Because if he has been silent for centuries, and yet was preparing the greatest event in redemptive history, then perhaps silence is not the end of history, but the space where it is being written out of our field of vision. And this logic applies not only to nations or generations, but also to specific individuals who have felt heaven closed not for hundreds of years, but for long enough to almost lose hope. People who carried promises, callings, and a sense of purpose, but who had to learn to live in the gap between what God said and what he has not yet revealed. There is a silent pattern that runs through the entire Bible that almost no one notices at first glance. Before God raises up great names, before calls become public, before missions change the course of history, there is almost always a disconcerting period of silence, an interval in which God does not explain, does not detail, does not anticipate. He simply keeps silent, and this silence does not happen after the call, but before it. It is as if the sky was closed just at the moment when a confirmation would be most expected. This detail changes everything because it reveals that silence does not come as punishment, but as preparation. Abraham received a promise, but walked for years without seeing anything happen. Joseph had grandiose dreams, but he spent decades between wells, prisons, and oblivion without new revelations. David was anointed king at a young age, but he had to live with silence as he fled. Hidden was treated anonymously. The call was there. The promise was clear, but the sky remained quiet long enough to shape something that no words could form. And this leads us to understand that God is in no hurry to explain, because he is more interested in forming. Silence is the environment where character is polished, where motivations are tested, where the ego is confronted, and where real dependence begins to be born. When God speaks all the time, there is a danger that we will cling to his voice and not his character. But when he is silent, we are forced to decide whether we will keep walking just because we trust who he is and not what he says at that moment. It is in this space that many give up because they confuse silence with rejection. But the great callings of the Bible were not delivered to people who had never experienced closed heaven. Rather, they were entrusted to those who had learned to remain faithful even when they felt nothing, even when they heard nothing, even when there were no visible signs that something was being prepared. The silence before the call works as an invisible filter. He separates those who want God only by the answers of those who want him even without answers. And this is profound because it reveals that God does not choose only capable people, but mature people in the hidden. Before Moses heard the voice coming from the burning bush, he heard only the sound of the wind in the wilderness. Before he spoke to God face to face, he lived with years of silent routine, no clear direction, no miracles, no supernatural signs. And this was not a delay in the plan. It was the plan. The silence prepared the inner ground so that when God spoke, that voice would not be mistaken for pride, impulse, or emotion. When heaven is silent before great calls, it is teaching something that can only be learned in the absence of words. Discernment, because those who learn to listen in silence can recognize the right voice when it finally manifests itself. And that explains why so many callings are missed today, not for lack of promise, but for lack of maturity built in the interval. God does not waste silence. He uses it as a tool. He uses it as a school. He uses it as an invisible process of alignment. And when we look at the Bible with this filter, we realize that silence does not precede only public missions, but profound transformations of identity. Before anyone can be used by God, they must learn to live without applause, without external confirmation, and without immediate responses. Because those who cannot stand silence will hardly sustain the responsibility of a call. And that is exactly why, when we speak of great callings, we cannot ignore the previous period when everything seemed to come to a standstill. Because it is at this point that we find one of the most human and most misinterpreted stories in all of Scripture. Moses is one of those figures that we usually see only at the end of the story, but almost never in the painful middle of the way. When we think of him, we remember the deliverer, the man who parted the sea, the leader who spoke to God. But before all this, there is a Moses who was chosen and, at the same time, ignored. And this tension is one of the hardest to bear in the spiritual life, knowing that there is a purpose, but living as if it did not exist. From birth, God's hand was on him in an evident way. He was born in the midst of a death decree, was placed in a basket, thrown into the river, and, improbably, raised inside the very palace that oppressed his people. Everything pointed to something big. Everything indicated that God had a plan. But the fact that it was chosen did not mean that it was immediately used. On the contrary, Moses grows up carrying an inner sense of identity that finds no echo in the sky. He knows he is a Hebrew. He feels the weight of injustice. He realizes that he was born for something greater, but God does not speak. It does not guide. It does not direct. It does not confirm. And this silence is deafening because it creates a deep internal conflict. The call seems real, but the absence of an answer makes everything seem like imagination. It is at this point that many get lost, because living with this tension wears out the soul. Moses looks around and sees the suffering of his people. He feels indignation, he feels urgency, but he has no education. So he does what many do when God doesn't respond. He acts on his own. He tries to anticipate the purpose. He tries to take matters into his own hands that which God has not yet authorized. And error is not born of malice, but of haste, from the pain of feeling ignored by heaven, from the anguish of carrying something inside you that does not find divine validation. Moses kills an Egyptian believing, perhaps, that this would be the beginning of liberation. But God's silence is not broken. On the contrary, it deepens. The people do not recognize him. The Hebrews reject him. The palace abandons him. And, in one fell swoop, Moses loses everything: position, identity, security, and direction. The chosen one is now a fugitive. The man raised as a prince is now treated like no one else. And here there is a hard truth that is almost never said. Being chosen does not prevent you from going through phases in which you seem forgotten. God's silence does not nullify the call, but it exposes whether we are prepared to wait. Moses was not ignored because God had given up on him. It was ignored because it still needed to be emptied of haste, self-strength, and the idea that God's purpose can be fulfilled in our time. Heaven did not respond when Moses wanted to act, because the call did not yet have enough root to support the weight of the mission. And that creates a deep wound, because nothing hurts more than realizing that you believed you were doing the right thing, and yet it all went wrong. This is the kind of silence that confuses, hurts, and questions one's faith. Moses doesn't hear God saying, wait. He just doesn't hear anything. And this absence of response is what pushes it into the desert, not only geographical, but internal. The man who once felt chosen must now learn to live without any sign that this is still true. And it is exactly at this point in history that we begin to realize that God's silence not only tests faith, but redefines who we are when no one is looking, when there is no promise being repeated, when there is no visible confirmation. Because before Moses was used as a deliverer, he needed to learn what it meant to be recognized by no one, not by men, not by heaven. And this process does not end quickly. On the contrary, it only begins there, at the moment when the chosen one starts to live as if he had been completely ignored. When you act in silence, without clear direction from God, you are almost always born from an understandable but dangerous place. It is born from the anxiety of not being able to bear the weight. It is born from the pain of feeling that time is passing and nothing is happening. It is born out of the fear that if you don't do something now, the purpose will be lost forever. Moses did not kill the Egyptian out of cruelty, but out of spiritual impatience. He believed that he needed to help God fulfill what seemed obvious. After all, if he was preserved from death, raised in the palace, educated as a prince, and aware of the oppression of his people, then the mission seemed too clear to wait. The problem is that purpose without time generates disaster, and God's silence, when ignored, turns into backwardness, not advancement. By acting without response, Moses did not advance deliverance. He postponed it for decades. This is hard to accept, because most of us believe that acting is always better than waiting. But the Bible reveals a different pattern. There are times when acting ahead of time doesn't speed up God's plan. It just shifts us out of his rhythm. Moses believed that this act of justice would be recognized, that the Hebrews would understand, that heaven would finally speak. But none of this happened. The silence remained, and along with it came the consequences. That single act, done on the impulse of a call that had not yet matured, closed doors, generated rejection, and forced Moses to flee. Here is a deep spiritual principle. God does not hurry, and when we try to force the fulfillment of the purpose, we end up carrying burdens that were not made for us at that time. Moses tried to free a people before he learned to lead himself. He tried to confront a system before he learned to listen. He tried to use force when God wanted to build character, and the result was exile. The silence of God, which could have been a space of waiting, has turned into a desert of correction, not because God punished Moses, but because Moses moved without God. And this directly touches the lives of those who are listening now, because how many important decisions were made exactly in this place? When we pray, we hear nothing, and we decide to act anyway. We change paths, break relationships, take responsibility, say what we shouldn't, all to alleviate the anguish of silence. But then we realize that we have not advanced. We just get more tired. The purpose did not die, but became more distant. Moses did not lose his calling, but he had to learn that zeal without direction does not produce deliverance. It produces escape. It produces fear. It produces insulation. And the most painful thing is to realize that sometimes the delay we fear so much does not come from God, but from the choices made when we cannot bear to wait for him. Silence was not a signal to act. It was an invitation to stop. But Moses did not understand this at that moment, and perhaps he did not even have the maturity to understand it. Therefore, history does not end it there. It only displaces him to another scenario where God will continue to work, even without speaking, even without visible signs. Because when we act in silence, the purpose does not end, but starts to be treated in another way, deeper, slower, and much more transformative. And it is exactly this invisible treatment that begins to reveal itself next, when the man who has tried to act with force must learn to live without any of them. Joseph was thrown into a well by his own brothers, and on that day the sky did not open to stop them. No voice echoed saying that it was part of a larger plan. He screamed. He was sold, humiliated, forgotten in an unjust prison, and for years all that existed was silence. Job lost children, health, dignity, and answers. He prayed, questioned, cried, argued with friends, and even confronted his own pain, but God remained silent for entire chapters. David was anointed king as a teenager, heard clear promises, felt the weight of the call, but instead of the throne he received persecution. He fled to caves, was betrayed, lived as a stranger in his own land, while the sky seemed closed over his head. What these stories have in common is not just suffering, it's the interval, the space between promise and fulfillment, the period in which God does not explain, does not answer, does not intervene in a visible way. The Bible does not hide this pattern, it repeats it. Whenever God chooses someone for something big, he allows for a time when everything seems small, unfair, or meaningless. Joseph had dreams, but no control. Job had faith, but no explanation. David had anointing, but no crown. And they all experienced this same spiritual discomfort, knowing that God exists, knowing that he promised something, and yet not hearing anything for a long time. This dismantles a dangerous idea that many carry today, that silence means error, punishment, or abandonment. If this were true, then God would have abandoned some of the greatest characters in biblical history. But what silence was actually doing was separating calling from haste, faith from emotion, trust from convenience. Joseph needed to learn to rule without power before he could rule with authority. Job needed to learn to trust without explanations before he could receive answers. David needed to learn to depend on God as a refuge before he could depend on a throne. Silence did not destroy them, it aligned them. And this directly confronts those who are listening now, because maybe you are living exactly this interval. The promise has already come, The dream has already been born, the faith already exists, but the sky is quiet. No nuclear door noise. And this generates a question that hurts. Why does God speak to some and be silent with others? The answer begins to appear when we realize that silence is not the absence of God. It is the deepest form of his presence when the character is still being formed. God speaks when he wants to inform, but is silent when he wants to transform. Joseph, Job, and David were not forgotten, were prosecuted. And this pattern does not end with them. It runs through Scripture like an invisible thread, linking all of God's great moves to a period when nothing seemed to be happening. The silence was not the end of their story. It was the environment where it began to take shape. And when we understand this, we realize that closed heaven does not mean that God has stopped acting, only that he is working at a level that we have not yet been able to see. There is a kind of silence that hurts because it feels empty, but there is another that weighs because it is too full. The silence that shapes is not comfortable. It does not bring immediate relief. It does not come with clear explanations, but it carries intention, unlike human abandonment, which is born of indifference. God's silence is born of deep care. When God is silent, he does not turn away. He approaches in a way that we don't notice. It is in this silence that God begins to touch areas that words would never reach. If he explained everything, there would be no room for faith. If he answered everything immediately, there would be no inner transformation. The silence that shapes confronts expectations, dismantles illusions and reveals hidden motivations. It takes away false endorsements, exposes wrong dependencies, and forces the heart to decide whether to trust God for what he does or who he is. Joseph was not abandoned in prison. He was shaped to rule without being corrupted. Job was not forgotten in his grief. He was brought to a level of intimacy that he would never have achieved if he had quick answers. David was not discarded in the caves. He was stoned so as not to rule with pride when he came to the throne. Abandonment breaks, but God's silence builds from within. He teaches to wait without giving up, to obey without applause, to remain faithful when there are no signs. And it hurts because it goes against everything we've learned about spiritual success, which is often associated with movement, immediate response, and constant confirmation. But God works in the opposite of this. He uses silence to separate those who seek results from those who seek relationships. When heaven seems closed, it's not because God has turned his back. It's because he's working in deeper layers of the soul, adjusting character to calling, aligning heart to purpose. This silence is not punishment. It is preparation. It's not rejection. It's refinement. And the greater the purpose, the deeper this invisible process usually is. Perhaps what you call abandonment is actually the moment when God is taking care of you the most. Even if everything around you seems to be at a standstill, because while you wait for external answers, God is producing internal changes that will sustain what is yet to come. And when we understand this, we begin to realize that silence is not the end of God's communication, but a different, more intense, more transformative language that sets the stage for something that cannot yet be revealed now. There are times when the absence of feeling scares more than pain, when there are no tears, no peace, no shivering, no sign that God is near. That's when a lot of people start to doubt not only what God is doing, but whether he's still doing anything, because we have been taught, directly or indirectly, that feeling is a sign of presence, and not feeling is a sign of distance. But the Bible quietly dismantles this logic. God has never conditioned his actions to our emotional perception. On the contrary, many times, he chooses to work precisely when everything in us is empty, tired, or anesthetized. When there is no emotion to sustain faith, God tests whether there is conviction. It is in this territory that he deepens the work. When we feel nothing, we stop negotiating with God through feelings and begin, without even realizing it, to learn to trust by decision. And that changes everything. Because faith based on sensation is fragile. All it takes is silence for it to crumble. But faith forged in the invisible stands when heaven does not respond. Moses spent years without feeling any confirmation of the call that once burned in his heart. Joseph spent long periods in which no promise seemed alive within him. David wrote entire psalms of a God who seemed distant, even though he was a man after his own heart. None of them lived a constant faith in emotional terms. What kept them going was something deeper, the certainty that God remained God even when nothing inside them reacted. It is at this point that God works most accurately. He silences emotions to treat fundamentals. It allows the feeling of emptiness to reveal where there is still dependence on feeling, because while we need to feel something to keep going, we haven't fully matured yet. When God takes us to this dry place, He is not weakening us, He is strengthening us in a way that does not appear on the surface. Character is shaped in spiritual boredom, in routine without answers, in day after day when nothing happens externally. It is there that resistance, fidelity, and depth are built. When we don't feel anything, do we keep praying? Do we continue to obey? Do we continue to trust? These questions are not asked out loud, but are answered by our silent attitudes. And God watches all of this. He works harder when we don't feel anything, because at that stage there is no applause. There is no emotional reward. There is no immediate sense of victory. Only the truth of the heart remains. It is there that He separates mature faith from emotional faith. And perhaps you are just at that point now, where you feel no pain or joy, no despair or excitement, just a spiritual weariness that you cannot explain. This place is not a sign of regression. It is often a sign of transition. Something is being dismantled so that something else can be built. And while you wait to feel something new, God is acting on levels you can't yet perceive, preparing the ground to reveal why this silence has never been empty. One of the most difficult questions of faith is not why God allows pain, but why He does not explain it. If only there was a clear answer, a direct reason, an advance warning saying hold on a little longer because this will make sense, everything would be different. But God rarely does that. He is silent, and let the silence speak for itself. And this deeply bothers human beings, because we want control, predictability, and understanding. We want to know why before continuing. But God does not build faith based on explanations, but on relationships. If He explained every silence, we wouldn't be trusting, we'd just be agreeing to a plan we already understand. The absence of explanation is not divine carelessness. It's method. God does not explain silence because explanation would often steal the process. Knowing too much ahead of time would prevent us from living what needs to be lived. Moses did not receive a manual saying why he would spend decades in anonymity. Joseph was not given a divine justification for the unjust imprisonment. Job did not receive a complete answer for his losses. And yet, they all went through the silence without understanding, but being transformed. God knows that some things only make sense after they cross us entirely. Before that, any explanation would be just information, not training. Silence forces the heart to reveal itself. Without answers, the real motivations appear. Do we continue for love or for convenience? Do we follow God for what He is or for what He does? When God is silent, He confronts us without saying a word. And that's where many give up. Not because God has abandoned them, but because they can't stand walking without emotional guarantees. Explanations calm the mind, but silence exposes the heart. And God is more interested in who we become than in making us comfortable during the process. There are silences that are not a break in communication, but an invitation to maturity. God does not explain silence because He wants to take us out of dependence on ready-made answers and into a deeper level of trust, a level where we obey without understanding, hope without feeling, and remain even when everything inside us calls for a justification. This is not easy. That's why silence hurts. It stirs old insecurities, the need for control, the fear of being alone. But, paradoxically, it is in this place that faith ceases to be theoretical and begins to be lived. When God doesn't explain, He's saying, without words, that there's still something building up in you that wouldn't survive if you were rushed. And perhaps the silence you live today is not a lack of response, but a protection against premature understanding. Because some truths, if revealed too soon, hinder more than help. And God would rather appear distant for a time than compromise what he is quietly forming. Every silence of God has a limit, even if it seems endless to us. There is a specific day, often invisible to human eyes, when the silence is broken, not because the pain is over, but because the time has been fulfilled. And when that happens, it almost never comes the way we imagined. Heaven does not open with trumpets immediately, nor are there always great signs. Sometimes the silence is broken with a simple word, an unexpected call, an order that changes everything inside before changing anything outside. For Moses, it was not at the height of his strength, nor when he still saw himself as a prince, nor when he thought he knew exactly what God wanted to do. The silence was broken when he was no longer in a hurry, when the ego had been worn down by time, when the heart was more prepared to obey than to appear. It was there, in the most unlikely place, in absolute anonymity, that God spoke. This reveals something profound about the way God acts. He doesn't break the silence when we're desperate for answers, but when we're ready to hear them without distorting them. The day the silence is broken is not the day everything improves instantly. It is the day when everything starts to make sense, even if externally nothing changes yet. It is as if God was saying, now you can sustain what you are going to hear. Before that, revelation would be a burden, not a gift. Many imagine that silence ends when pain ends, but in the Bible the pattern is different. Silence ends when the character is aligned with the calling, when God's voice finally comes. It doesn't explain every detail of the past, but it completely redefines the future. Moses received no answers about the lost years. He received a mission that gave them new meaning. The silence was not wasted. It was an investment. And this completely changes the way we see our own waiting periods. The day when silence is broken is not a prize for those who have endured the most, but a turning point for those who have been molded into the invisible. It is the moment when we realize that God has never been absent, only working away from the stage. When He speaks, we understand that heaven was not closed, it was under construction. And this realization is disconcerting, because it forces us to face a difficult truth. If God had spoken earlier, we might have run away from the process. The silence is broken when we no longer need it to validate our faith, when trust no longer depends on feeling, but on staying. And it is precisely there that God's voice echoes again, not only to comfort, but to send, direct, and demand something greater. Because silence prepares, but the word summons, and when that summons comes, it carries with it all the weight and all the authority of a God who has spoken little, but He worked full time. And it is from this point that the story stops being just about waiting and becomes about responding to what God says after so long being silent, because what comes next requires a heart that has been deeply treated in silence. And if silence isn't the problem you need to eliminate, but what signal do you need to interpret? This question changes everything, because it forces us to look at God's silence not as a failure in divine communication, but as a language that we rarely learn to decipher. From an early age, we learn that a quick response is synonymous with care, and the absence of a response is rejection. We take this logic to faith. When God speaks, we believe He is near. When God is silent, we assume that something has gone wrong with us or with Him. But the Bible reveals an uncomfortable pattern. God is silent just when He is closer than ever. Silence does not arise when God steps aside, but when He chooses to work at levels that words cannot reach. If silence were absence, Moses would have been abandoned in the wilderness. Jose would have been forgotten in prison. Dovey would have been discarded on the field. Job would have been ignored in pain, but none of them were abandoned. Everyone was being prepared. The problem is that silence confronts our need for control. As God speaks, feel that we have direction. When He is silent, we are forced to face who we really are without detailed instructions, without visible guarantees, without spiritual applause. And that's exactly where silence becomes a sign that God is dealing with something deeper than circumstance. He is treating the way we react when we don't understand. Silence reveals whether our faith depends on the voice or on presence. It reveals whether we seek God for what He says or for who He is. When all is silent, There are no new verses, no intense sensations, no clear answers. All that remains is the daily decision to stay, and remaining unanswered is one of the greatest acts of faith there is. Maybe heaven seems closed because God is protecting you from hearing something too soon. Perhaps He is preventing you from running to a destiny that you cannot yet sustain. Silence, then, ceases to be a punishment and becomes a loving break, an invisible care, a not yet that saves more than a hasty yes. Silence as a sign also reveals spiritual maturity. God speaks, less when He knows that you have understood enough to keep walking, just like a father who lets go of his son's hand not because of abandonment, but because he trusts that he already knows how to walk. Closed heaven does not mean that God has stopped acting. It means that He is acting without the need to explain every step, and that hurts because it takes us out of the center. It forces us to trust without negotiating. He invites us to obey without applause. When we understand this, something changes inside. Anxiety decreases. The comparison loses strength. The rush begins to die because we realize that silence is not a mistake in the plan. It is part of it. And perhaps the right question is no longer why is God silent, but what is this silence producing in me now? Because when silence is a sign, it points to something bigger that is still forming, something that cannot be rushed, something that requires a whole heart, not just desperate for answers. And it is exactly at this point that we are led to face the last and most uncomfortable truth of this journey. Silence does not change when we ask for explanations. It changes when we are ready to live what comes after it. Now, bring all of this into your own story, not for distant biblical history, nor for characters who lived thousands of years ago, but for the exact point in their lives where heaven seems closed today, for that specific area where you prayed, insisted, cried, waited, and nothing happened. Because that's when this video stops being just biblical content and becomes a mirror. Maybe you're living in a silence that no one sees, a spiritual silence that does not appear on social networks, that does not become a quick testimony, that does not yield beautiful phrases, a silence that only you know. What if that silence is not the end of your story, but the gap between who you were and who you are becoming? The Bible shows that God never breaks the silence before the time is right, because when He speaks too soon, He interrupts the process. Silence preserves. Silence matures. Silence separates those who want quick answers from those who are willing to be transformed. Maybe you're asking God to speak, when in fact He's waiting for you to stay, staying faithful when you don't feel anything, to remain whole when no one is looking, to remain obedient when there is no visible promise. It is in this place that leaders are born, not followers of emotions. It is in this place that faith ceases to be dependent on signs and is sustained by conviction. If heaven seems closed today, maybe it's because God trusts you more than you think. Trust that you no longer need constant explanations to keep walking. Trust that you can endure silence without abandoning purpose. Trust that when He finally speaks, you'll be ready to listen and, more than listening, to obey. The silence does not last forever. It never lasted in the Bible, but it always lasted the exact time necessary for something bigger to be prepared. And when silence is broken, it does not break into small pieces. It breaks into a call, into a direction, into a mission. So don't despise this time. Don't run away from it. Don't treat it as punishment. Maybe heaven is closed because God is opening you up from within. And the question that remains is not whether God will speak. He always speaks, but who you will be when that silence finally ends. If this message describes exactly what you're experiencing right now, write a simple word in the comments. Staying. This isn't about empty engagement. It's about declaring, even in silence, that you're not going to give up in the middle of the process. Thanks for watching.